In the shadow of the crumbling Roman Empire, as the Western world stumbled into the murky beginnings of the medieval age, two distinct peoples began shaping their destinies on opposite sides of a narrow stretch of water, the English Channel. To the north, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain fractured, and tribals struggled to hold power in the wake of Roman withdrawal. To the south, the Franks under Clovis began to unify Gaul, establishing the foundations of what would become France. Their early stories were born of war, ambition, and faith. And though they developed apart, their fates would become entangled in ways neither could have predicted across the centuries. These two nations would clash court and copy one another, fighting bitter wars, forming fragile alliances, and ultimately shaping the very notion of nationhood. In Europe, the early medieval centuries saw the slow consolidation of power in both lands. In England, Alfred the Great resisted Viking incursions and laid the groundwork for a unified kingdom, while in France, Charlemagne built a sprawling empire that reached deep into Central Europe and crowned himself emperor under the blessing of the Pope. Yet while Charlemagne's legacy fractured upon his death, England continued its slow crawl toward unity. By the 11th century, the English crown had become a prized possession, drawing the gaze of an ambitious duke from Normandy, a region in northern France that owed fealty to the French king but acted with practical independence. William the Conqueror claimed that the childless Edward the Confessor of England had promised him the throne, but when Edward died, Harold Godwinson seized the crown. William crossed the Channel in 1066, landing with an army of knights and mercenaries, and defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings. The Norman conquest changed everything, not just for England, but for France. William now held two titles, King of England and Duke of Normandy, and in that overlap lay the seeds of centuries of conflict from that moment on. English kings were also French lords, holding lands in France and owing theoretical allegiance to the French crown, but acting with growing defiance. The tension between vassalage and sovereignty, between feudal obligation and royal ambition, created a volatile relationship that would flare into open warfare time and again over the next several centuries. This dual identity of the English monarchy introduced French culture, language, and law into England, transforming its aristocracy, its architecture, and its administrative systems. While in France, the presence of a powerful English king on French soil remained a constant threat. The Plantagenet dynasty, which emerged from the marriage of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, inherited more French land than the French king himself, ruling vast territories from Normandy to the Pyrenees. This imbalance enraged the French monarchy, especially under Philip Augustus, who began a campaign to strip the English kings of their continental holdings. By the early 13th century, much of that land had been retaken, but the rivalry had only deepened. Beneath the royal drama lay societies that mirrored and diverged in equal measure. Both countries relied on feudal hierarchies with lords, knights, and serfs. Both were deeply influenced by the Catholic Church, which legitimized rulers and disciplined rebellion. Yet the seeds of distinct identities were taking root. In England, the common law system began to take shape, offering a shared legal framework that would define English governance. While in France, royal edicts and local customs coexisted in a more fragmented patchwork of jurisdictions. Even the idea of kingship began to differ in France. Kings claimed a sacred authority rooted in divine right, while in England, the idea emerged that a king might be limited by law, a concept born from baronial resistance and enshrined in the Magna Carta of 1215, which, though aimed at restraining King John, set a precedent for constitutional governance. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th, the relationship between France and England shifted again, with growing nationalism, rising trade, and mounting military ambition. And while their crown still held intertwined roots, the two nations began to see each other not as siblings or rivals, but as enemies fated to clash in war that would shape the very soul of Europe. The 14th century opened with a question of bloodlines and crowns that would ignite a fire lasting over a century. When Charles IV of France died without a male heir, the French nobility invoked Salic law, barring succession through the female line, and crowned Philip VI. Yet Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV, through his mother, claimed a superior right to the throne of France. Edward's claim was not mere vanity. It was political strategy and the perfect excuse for war. In 1337, he declared himself the rightful king of France and launched what would become known as the 100 Years' War, a brutal and prolonged conflict that would stretch across 5 generations of monarchs and leave both nations scarred, transformed, and forever entangled. The war was not a single continuous battle, but a series of campaigns. Truces, betrayals, and revolts marked by legendary clashes and shifting fortunes. In the early stages, the English dominated thanks in part to superior tactics and weaponry, especially the deadly longbow which decimated French knights at battles like Crécy and Poitiers. These victories established English control over vast swaths of northern France and forced humiliating treaties on the French crown. But the war was not fought by kings alone. It consumed the lives of thousands of archers' men. At arms, peasants and civilians' towns were razed, fields burned, and famine followed armies, not only fought one another but pillaged the countryside to feed themselves, leaving villages in ruin and economies in tatters. Both countries faced internal unrest. The English Parliament demanded more say in governance as the costs of war mounted, and in France, the nobility struggled to maintain control. As the monarchy weakened and rival factions emerged in this chaos, rose an unexpected savior for the French, a young peasant girl from Domremy named Joan of Arc. Claiming divine visions, she inspired a broken nation, rallied French forces, and led the Dauphin Charles to his coronation in Reims. Her presence at the siege of Orléans marked a turning point, and her capture and execution by the English only deepened her legend. Joan's martyrdom infused the French with renewed purpose, and over the next decades the tide of war turned as France reasserted control under Charles VII and implemented military reforms, including the creation of a standing army. The English began to lose ground, plagued by poor leadership, economic strain, and civil unrest back home, particularly the War of the Roses, which divided their nobility and weakened their focus on continental affairs by 1453. The war drew to a close with England retaining only the port city of Calais and France emerging as a more centralized and powerful state. The 100 Years' War had reshaped both nations politically, economically, and culturally. It marked the end of feudal armies and the rise of national military institutions. It forged early senses of national identity with the English and French, seeing themselves not as feudal vassals, but as subjects of distinct realms. Defined by language, history, and struggle, the war also accelerated changes in governance. England's parliament grew in power as kings relied on it to fund campaigns and justify taxes, while in France the monarchy reasserted control over rebellious nobles and began the long process of unifying its legal and administrative systems. Both nations had begun to transform from medieval feudal societies into early modern states with stronger monarchies, more complex bureaucracies, and emerging national consciousness. Yet beneath the progress lay deep wounds. The countryside of northern France remained devastated for decades, whole regions depopulated or impoverished, and the psychological scars of endless war lived on in stories, ballads, and chronicles. While the war had ended, the rivalry had not, and even in peace, the memory of conquest, betrayal, and ambition lingered in the royal courts and common hearts alike. As the 15th century closed, the destinies of France and England remained bound not by conquest but by consequence. Their histories had intertwined in violence, but their futures would now unfold in parallel, each facing internal challenges, religious upheaval, and the dawn of new empires across oceans. Yet the echoes of the 100 Years' War would shape how they approached kingship, nationhood, and one another forevermore. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, France and England stood at a crossroads. Shaped by the long wars behind them and by the winds of change sweeping across Europe, the Renaissance brought new ideas, art, and science, and with it came challenges to old powers, including the Church, which had for centuries stood as the moral and political spine of both kingdoms. While France emerged from the Hundred Years' War under a strengthened monarchy, England faced internal strife that erupted into the War of the Roses, a brutal dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York. This conflict decimated the English nobility and concluded with the rise of the Tudor dynasty under Henry VII, who sought to rebuild royal authority through diplomacy, careful taxation, and strategic marriages. His son Henry VIII would not only strengthen the monarchy further, but shatter England's religious unity in a decision driven by politics, pride, and personal desire. Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church when the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England and initiating the English Reformation. Monasteries were dissolved, wealth seized, and a new national church born. Protestantism began to take root, not only as a theology, but as a political statement, separating England from the Catholic powers of Europe, including France, which remained staunchly Catholic under the Valois monarchy. While England wrestled with reform and rebellion, France struggled with its own religious tensions as Protestant ideas spread among the nobility and urban classes. The kingdom descended into a series of civil wars, known as the French Wars of Religion, between Catholics and Huguenots. These conflicts were marked by massacres, assassinations, and shifting alliances. Most infamously, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and beyond. Though France remained nominally united, its social fabric was torn and its monarchy weakened by internal division. By contrast, England under Elizabeth II consolidated Protestantism, defeated the Spanish Armada, and projected a sense of national unity through cultural flourishing. The Elizabethan age became a symbol of strength, identity, and emerging imperial ambition. The rivalry between France and England took on a new dimension as both nations turned their gaze toward the seas and the promise of new worlds in the Americas. Both sought colonial footholds, both funded explorers and privateers, and both began to imagine empires that extended far beyond the narrow waters of the Channel. Their military conflicts in Europe gave way to commercial and territorial competition abroad. While the political landscape at home continued to shift, England faced a growing tension between monarchy and parliament, a divide that would one day erupt into civil war, while France saw the rise of absolutism under Louis XIII and later Louis XIV, who declared l'État, c'est moi, the state is me, and embodied the pinnacle of royal centralization. The French monarchy built Versailles as a symbol of divine rule and cultural dominance, while the English crown struggled to balance divine right with the demands of a political system increasingly rooted in law and consent. The 17th century tested both nations in different ways. England beheaded a king and replaced monarchy with a republic under Oliver Cromwell, only to restore it under Charles II and later invite a foreign king, William of Orange, to take the throne. In the Glorious Revolution, cementing parliamentary supremacy, France, meanwhile, crushed noble uprisings, centralized power in the hands of the king, and built an efficient state bureaucracy, funded by taxes and supported by a professional army. And yet while France looked inward to control its nobles and unify its identity, England looked outward, expanding its navy, its trade, and its colonial ventures, sowing the seeds of what would become the British Empire. Both nations claimed to be the light of civilization. Yet they continued to cast shadows across each other's ambitions, from courtly intrigue to battlefield rivalry, from religious doctrine to economic policy. They remained entangled mirrors of one another, different in structure, but alike in drive. Kings and queens ruled with splendor, but always under the watchful eyes of restless subjects and shifting alliances. And as the 18th century approached the world, they once fought over with swords, and treaties was expanding, bringing new pressures, new opportunities, and a new era of revolution just beyond the horizon. As the 18th century unfolded, France and England found themselves once again at the heart of European power politics, but this time, their battlefield was not limited to the soil of their own lands or even the continent of Europe. Instead, their rivalry extended across oceans to distant colonies, trade routes, and emerging empires. The 7 Years' War, often called the First True World War, pitted these two nations against one another across North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. The British emerged victorious, seizing Canada from the French, dismantling their presence in India, and positioning themselves as the dominant naval and colonial power in the world. This war drained the coffers of both nations, but it was France that bore the greater economic and psychological blow. Its loss of colonial prestige, combined with a rising national debt, growing discontent among its third estate, and the burden of maintaining a privileged aristocracy, pushed it toward the edge of collapse. Meanwhile, England, though triumphant, also faced mounting pressures, especially in the American colonies, where resistance to taxation without representation flared into open rebellion. The American Revolution became a stage for both nations to renew their rivalry, with France supporting the revolutionaries, not only out of ideological sympathy, but as a strategic blow to British power. The success of the American Revolution inspired movements across Europe, but none more dramatically than in France itself, where the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity ignited the French Revolution in 1789. The fall of the Bastille marked the beginning of a seismic shift in the French social and political order. The monarchy was abolished. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were executed, and France descended into a period of radical republicanism, terror, and ultimately the rise of a new form of autocracy through the figure of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's military genius, political ambition, and vision of continental dominance posed the greatest threat England had faced since the days of the Spanish Armada under his leadership. France conquered vast portions of Europe, spreading revolutionary principles as well as imperial control. He crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804, signaling a new era where merit, not birth, determined power in theory, though in practice, his rule was as absolute as any monarch before him. England stood nearly alone against this new empire, using its navy to blockade France, its diplomats to forge shifting coalitions, and its financial institutions to fund war on a global scale. The Napoleonic Wars raged for over a decade, culminating in pivotal battles like Trafalgar, where Admiral Nelson ensured British naval supremacy, and Waterloo, where the Duke of Wellington dealt Napoleon his final defeat. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe, restoring monarchies and seeking to contain revolutionary fervor. But the ideas unleashed by both the American and French revolutions could not be caged, and both England and France found themselves grappling with the consequences. In the decades that followed, France oscillated between monarchy, empire, and republic, enduring revolutions in 1830 and 1848, before finally settling into a fragile democratic framework with the rise of the Third Republic, while England, though more stable, underwent its own transformations. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed the English economy, and society. Factories rose where fields once stood, and cities swelled with workers drawn from rural life. The British Empire expanded rapidly, with colonies across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific held together by maritime dominance and a sense of civilizing mission, fueled by both economic greed and imperial ideology. France, too, sought to rebuild its global presence, re-establishing colonies in North Africa, Indochina, and the Caribbean, competing once again with Britain for influence and resources. Although war between them no longer defined their relationship, the competition remained. Fierce through diplomacy, culture, and economic development, both nations projected power abroad, even as their domestic landscapes changed at home. England saw the gradual extension of suffrage, the rise of a powerful middle class, and increasing pressure. For labor rights and social reforms in France, the legacy of the Revolution remained a turbulent force, inspiring both liberal dreams and authoritarian reactions from Napoleon III's Second Empire to the formation of republican institutions. France continually wrestled with its dual identity as a land of revolution and order, and as the 19th century came to a close, both nations stood at the edge of a new modern world shaped by nationalism, industrial capitalism, and the emerging fault. Lines that would soon divide Europe on a massive scale, though their swords had been mostly sheathed. Their rivalry transformed from open war into a more subtle contest of influence, science, culture, and empire, and it was this new form of competition that would define the next chapter of their entangled fates. As the 20th century dawned, France and England were no longer medieval monarchies or rival feudal powers, but modern nation-states shaped by centuries of war, revolution, empire, and reform. They had emerged from their respective pasts as industrial powers with global empires, parliamentary institutions, and distinct national identities. Yet their histories remained closely intertwined, defined not only by rivalry, but increasingly by cooperation. Their relationship had matured from one of mutual suspicion and military aggression into a more complex mixture of competition, respect, and cautious partnership. They had long fought over land thrones and religious dominance, but now they faced a new world, one defined not by knights and castles, but by mechanized warfare, global commerce, and ideological upheaval. The Industrial Revolution had transformed both nations, their cities filled with smoke and factories, their populations swelling with workers drawn from rural villages, their empires now stretched across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Their fleets dominated the seas, and their cultures influenced people far beyond their borders. But these empires came at a cost. Beneath the grandeur of imperial dominance lay tensions among colonized peoples, growing nationalist movements, economic inequality, and rising demands for independence and civil rights. And though France and England remained at the forefront of global power, they sensed that the age of European supremacy might not last forever. In 1904, the signing of the Entente Cordiale marked a diplomatic revolution after centuries of war. The two nations began a new chapter of cautious alliance. The agreement settled long-standing colonial disputes and paved the way for closer military and political cooperation in the face of rising threats from Germany. When the First World War erupted in 1914, France and England stood together in defense of Belgium and the fragile balance of European power. What followed was unlike any conflict the world had ever seen. Trench warfare, machine guns, chemical weapons, and mass mobilization turned the fields of France into killing grounds. Millions perished, and an entire generation was traumatized. The war left deep scars on both societies, physically, mentally, and politically. In France, towns and cities were reduced to rubble, while in England families mourned sons, fathers, and brothers lost in foreign soil. The war forged a bond between the two nations, born of blood, shared sacrifice, and the grim knowledge that peace could never again be taken for granted. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was intended to prevent another catastrophe, but its punitive terms, especially against Germany, planted the seeds of future conflict. Both France and England struggled to recover economically and socially in the interwar years, coping with inflation, unemployment, and political unrest, while also navigating the rise of fascism and communism across Europe. By the late 1930s, it became clear that another war was looming when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. France and England once again declared war on Germany, standing together as they had before, but this time with a deep understanding of the horrors to come. The early years of World War II were devastating for France, which fell swiftly under German occupation, while England endured the Blitz and stood defiantly under the leadership of Winston Churchill, alone against the Nazi war machine. During this time, France was divided between the collaborationist Vichy regime and the Free French forces, led by General Charles de Gaulle, who operated from London with the support of the British government. The alliance between England and the Free French was not always smooth, but it was vital to the resistance and to the hope of liberation. In 1944, British and American forces launched the D-Day invasion on the beaches of Normandy, a historic operation that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany and the liberation of France. Once again, English and French soldiers bled side by side for freedom and justice, and the experience of war reinforced the necessity of partnership in the post-war years. Both nations faced the enormous task of rebuilding their shattered economies, infrastructures, and societies at home while managing the unraveling of their overseas empires abroad. The years following 1945 witnessed the slow and often painful process of decolonization. India, Algeria, Vietnam, Kenya, and many more names etched into the memories of a generation. Both France and England faced resistance and revolution in their colonies and were forced to confront the moral contradictions of empire in a world increasingly defined by self-determination and human rights. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a turning point. Both nations attempted to reclaim influence in Egypt, but were forced to withdraw under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, a humiliating moment that revealed the limits of their post-war power and the rise of a new global order in which former colonial masters would have to adapt or be left behind. It also reinforced the importance of transatlantic alliances and European cooperation as a means of maintaining relevance in the Cold War world. France and England responded differently to these challenges. France under de Gaulle sought to reassert national independence, withdrawing from NATO's integrated command and pursuing a strong nuclear policy, while promoting European integration as a means of asserting influence without dependence on superpowers. England, meanwhile, embraced its special relationship with the United States while maintaining a skeptical and often reluctant approach to European unity. Despite these differences, the two nations remained close partners within NATO, the United Nations, and other international institutions, the European Economic Community. Later, the European Union brought their economies and policies closer than ever, and while tensions occasionally flared over issues of sovereignty, agriculture, or finance, the overarching trajectory was one of cooperation rather than conflict. Cultural exchanges, student programs, military collaborations, and shared commemorations of the world wars deepened the sense of a shared past and an interconnected future. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, the rise of terrorism, and the digital revolution introduced new challenges and new dimensions to their relationship. And as the 21st century unfolded, both France and England faced a rapidly changing global landscape defined by climate change, technological transformation, migration, and political fragmentation. The United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union in the 2016 Brexit referendum marked a significant rupture, but not a return to hostility, while political integration may have suffered. The need for strategic partnership in areas like security, trade, and diplomacy remained as important as ever. Today, France and England are two of the oldest democracies in the world, former empires now shaped by immigration diversity and evolving national narratives. They are allies in the fight against terrorism, collaborators in scientific and cultural endeavors, and partners in confronting global crises. Though their languages differ, their values often align and their people more interconnected than ever. Understand that the old story of rivalry has given way to something deeper and more enduring, a recognition that they are not simply two nations separated by a narrow sea, but two pillars of a shared civilization forged in centuries of fire, now standing side by side in an uncertain yet hopeful future. From the Norman conquest to Napoleon, from Agincourt to Normandy, from colonial competition to constitutional reform, the tale of France and England is one of transformation. The enemies of old have become the stewards of modern Europe. Their flags once waved in defiance now rise together in remembrance, their histories still distinct, yet profoundly linked, and their futures bound not by conquest, but by cooperation and shared destiny.